Our next guest is one of the best writers around, in my opinion, on popular music. He's also a musician. Elijah Wald is the author of a number of books, including Narco Corrido, A Journey into the Music of Drugs, Guns, and Guerrillas, How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll, and Alternative History of American Popular Music. And his latest book is Dylan Goes Electric, Newport, Seeger, Dylan, and the Night That Split the 60s. Elijah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, yeah, I love your writing. I love the topic of this book, and I'm just old enough. I was a little kid, but I do remember the controversy around Dylan's appearance at Newport. So give us just a quick, like 50,000-foot overview of what happened that day.
It's tricky because there's so many different ways that people remember it. I mean, the very short version is it was the Newport Folk Festival. Dylan had been there in 63 and 64, and a lot of people sort of thought of him as one of the symbols of the festival and of the importance of folk music in the modern world. And in 65, he suddenly came on stage with a very loud rock and roll band. He had never performed with a band before, at least not since high school. He was in a black leather jacket. He looked like a biker. Nobody had ever heard anything that loud at Newport. And some people were thrilled. Some people hated it. There were cheers, but there was also an audible amount of booing, and nobody had ever heard of anyone booing Dylan. And I think for all sorts of reasons, partly just because in 65 a lot of other things were changing, it became this iconic story of sort of the split of Dylan from the folk scene and in a way, the birth of modern rock.
Yeah, it's fascinating, but people who weren't there or haven't read about it might not realize that, in 1965, and I get Dylan had recorded with rock musicians,
sure.
Subterranean Homesick Blues, Mixed Up Confusion in 1963, I guess. But
sure, and I mean, like a Rolling Stone was on the radio that weekend, and the day before when he'd played acoustic, it was the song the most people were yelling for him to play. So it wasn't like people at Newport didn't know he did that.
Right, but the symbolism, and I think I think you touched on it, that the Newport Folk Festival and that whole scene, Pete Seeger and Joan Baez and so on, that had embraced Dylan so affectionately and so enthusiastically I was talking about this with a friend of mine last night, Elijah, and I said, there was a wholesomeness to it that an entire generation wanted to reject, even though their politics were great and they were wonderful. Dylan comes out and he's got the Cuban high-heeled boots and the tight jeans and the black leather jacket, and basically everything about his appearance there, from his physical appearance to the loud rock and roll accompaniment. In those days, rock and roll by the folk crowd was considered vulgar, beneath them, commercial. So a lot of people thought that Dylan had sold out, right?
Absolutely. I wouldn't call it wholesome, though, because, I mean, the way everybody described Dylan in 63 when they loved him was as scruffy and unkempt. I mean, nobody ever described Dylan as wholesome.
Right. I wasn't describing Dylan as wholesome. I was describing that scene of the Newport Folk Festival and Pete Seeger, and there was a lovableness, kind of healthiness about. Yes, they adopted this kind of waif-like Bob Dylan, or this scruffy guy, but and he had an edge, always had an edge, I think. I
think it's funny and complicated because, I mean, Baez regularly arrived with a cavalcade of bikers.
Oh, really? Okay.
Back to 1960.
Uh-huh.
And Pete Seeger was somebody who had just been fighting through the courts with a 10-year jail sentence hanging over his head. I think one of the things people have often misunderstood about this is that the history has tended to get written over and over and over by rock fans who want to paint the whole folk scene as being kind of the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul, and Mary. But, Pete Seeger, I mean, the crazy thing about this whole story, in a way, is that it normally gets told with Pete as the conservative old guy and Dylan as the young rebel. But even 4 years later, Johnny Cash was having Dylan on his TV show and couldn't get Seeger on because Seeger was too controversial.
Right.
I mean, from the point of view of mainstream America, Seeger remained a scarier figure in a lot of ways than Dylan. It's complicated.
Well, and Seeger, no, you're absolutely right, and I appreciate the correction. We're talking with Elijah Wald, author of Dylan Goes Electric. It was Pete Seeger who went on the Smothers Brothers show and sang a song that was allegorical about Lyndon Johnson, Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, talking about Vietnam, and sort of reaffirmed the institutional reasons why they were afraid of him and his politics. So yes, I get point well taken. Seeger definitely, and those folks definitely had an edge to them, and I probably was repeating some of the rock imprinting I've gotten over the years. But
yeah, it's confusing. I mean, for Americans in the 1950s, were Brando and James Dean more or less scary than communists?
Well, that's an interesting question. Right. Absolutely, the different lobes of the lizard brain were being triggered.
Exactly.
Listen. So let me ask you. Speaking of Pete Seeger, because really people, I think you describe Pete as one of the founders of the whole Newport Folk Festival scene, and there was this myth at the time, and I maybe it was a myth, maybe it was true. I want to ask you, but the story at the time that went out was that Pete was so outraged by this loud rock and roll band that Dylan had playing that he tried to get an axe and cut the power lines, and that he screaming in rage and furious at the betrayal. What about that?
Yes, furious, no axe.
Right,
okay. is the short version.
Right. Okay. So he was furious.
He was upset. He was furious. He was unhappy. I mean, I think he was essentially watching his dream falling apart.
Yeah.
And whether one likes his dream or hates his dream, one can understand why that was tough.
Right.
And his dream was falling apart. I mean, it's not like Seeger was wrong. I mean, the dream that folk music would become the part of a process whereby black and white and young and old would unite in a huge nonviolent movement that would change America, which really had been the dream in, Martin Luther King's March on Washington.
Right. Where Bob Dylan sang, so, and part of that, I guess, do you think Pete Seeger and some of his colleagues invested too much of that hope? Do you think Pete himself invested too much of his dream in Dylan himself as the
No question.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I think be it Pete or be it Dylan, however else you may look at it, that certainly is true. They certainly, he invested in a Bob Dylan that may have existed for a little while, but it was not who Bob Dylan wanted to be. It was scary, among other things, for Dylan. I mean, it was a moment when being the voice of a generation, a lot of voices of that generation were getting shot. Yeah,
absolutely. And Elijah Wald, writer and musician, I want to talk a little bit now about, no one can plumb the depths of Dylan's personality. Many have gotten lost in that maze. But I do want to ask you, because the quote that comes to mind is from Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali in the 60s, I remember saying, he said he was so famous that he could be shot up in a rocket ship and come down anywhere on the planet Earth and walk to the nearest house and they would know who he was. And to a certain extent, I think Bob Dylan, when he was 22 or something, had something like that level of fame, as well as all the hope that was invested in him as the voice of the generation. Was he just desperately trying to break that and untether himself from that by any means necessary?
Yeah. No, I think certainly. I mean, to be fair, Dylan really didn't have that kind of fame. I mean, honestly, as a grade school kid in that period, I could name all four Beatles, but I wasn't yet aware of Dylan in 64 or 65. That was definitely something the older kids knew about. But as a little kid, I was aware of the Monkees and the Beatles and not Dylan.
That's funny, because I was a little kid, too. We're probably around the same age, and I definitely knew who Dylan was. Did you know who Muhammad Ali was? Yeah, oh, interesting.
I mean, some people were on the, Dylan was not on the cover of a lot of mainstream magazines.
Right.
He occasionally showed up, but he wasn't all over television. I mean, I knew who Muhammad Ali was the same way I knew who Howard Cosell was.
Right, right.
I mean, if you had a television, you couldn't not.
Right. No, that's okay. Point well taken. We're talking with Elijah Wald, author of Dylan Goes Electric. Now, when I had never heard Dylan's music. That was for the college kids. My baby, the college kids, my college-age cousin knew who Dylan was. But in terms of,
you see, I didn't have a college-age cousin, and that's probably a big piece of it.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. But then when I heard his music, it was like a Rolling Stone, which for little 11 or 12-year-old me definitely turned my head around. And I'll just tell you, just parenthetically, I'm just curious your thoughts about this. The one that I really related to as a pre-adolescent was Positively 4th Street. You've got a lot of nerve to say you are my friend. As a junior high school or elementary school kid, I knew exactly how that felt.
See, you're exactly enough older than me that our experiences of this one are completely different. And that's what's so difficult, I think, about doing history.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's what's fascinating to me about projects like this, that whether you were 8 years old or 14 years old back then, the world looked completely different.
Absolutely. Man, that is extremely true. And therefore, and of course, what part of the country you were in, we were much less of a homogenous country. We didn't have...
Whether you were black or white.
Absolutely.
I remember this crazy moment when I was in high school, which is the mid-'70s, of being in a conversation with a black girl who was in my class, and Dylan's name came up, and she said, "Who?"
Right.
And I said, "Dylan, you've never heard of Bob Dylan?" And she said, "What do you mean? Have you ever heard of the 3 Degrees?"
Right. Had you?
No, I had not. And they had the #1 hit in the United States, which Dylan had never had.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember what their hit was.
I don't even remember. It was. I'm not even sure it was #1, but I mean they were huge at that moment.
Right.
And, right. I was out of touch with that moment. I was back home listening to Dylan records.
Well, and that's a point too. Music, not only society, and we're talking with Elijah Wald, author of Dylan Goes Electric. Not only music, but society was, or rather vice versa. Not only society, but music was very segregated in those days. And, it wasn't like the 40s when you had race records and hillbilly records, but there certainly were different radio stations. People talked about the crossover hits, and they were still fairly unusual. And, of course, folk was a genre that had its own little niche to it. And Dylan, that's why the accusation that Dylan was selling out, right? Because you could sell a lot more records if you were in the rock and roll.
Well, and I think something it's very, very hard for people my age and younger to understand is that before 1964, grown-ups just didn't listen to rock.
Right.
I mean, it was teenage music, and even teenagers who loved rock assumed that if they went to college, they'd get into something else. I mean, that was Dylan's story. He'd had his high school rock and roll band, and then he went off to college and got into folk music, and that's what you were supposed to do, was to grow up and stop listening to that noisy kid stuff.
Right. Dylan, by the way, I got to ask you this because you study. Dylan used to go around saying that when he was a teenager, he played piano for Bobby Vee, who was a rock and roll star in the 1950s. Did he really? Because it never seemed to me he had the chops for that.
Well, you didn't need a lot of chops.
Okay.
He had lied to Bobby Vee and said that he had previously worked with Conway Twitty, which was not true.
Right.
But, Bobby Vee, keep in mind, Dylan was at that point like 17 or 18, and Bobby Vee was 2 years younger.
Really?
And had a little band out of Fargo, North Dakota.
Uh-huh. Okay.
And Dylan seemed like an older teenager who knew how to play rock and roll piano, and Bobby Vee hired him, and they did like 2 gigs together.
Take Good Care of My Baby. That was Bobby Vee's big hit. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
So, all right. So now, having written this book on Dylan Goes Electric, we've talked about the personalities a little bit. We talked about Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan. But why do you think this, as you put it, created this cultural split, this moment when he went electric? What was that all about?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One of them is that the split was happening anyway. I mean, that weekend happens to also be the weekend when Lyndon Johnson doubled the draft and firmly committed the U.S. to victory in Vietnam. And the shift was also happening in the civil rights movement. That was the year that SNCC, which had organized the Freedom Summer of college students going south the previous year, now was kicking all the white people out of the organization. So, you know, the world was changing. And this really did signal that split. But also rock, you know, the fact that Dylan went electric in some ways, I think, is less important in this story than the fact that he was booed. Because when he got booed, everybody ever since has compared that to Stravinsky and The Rite of Spring in 1913.
Where there was also a riot and booing.
No, right. And nobody before that would it ever have occurred to them to compare a rock and roller to Stravinsky. And ever since, the idea that rock is serious modern art is something pretty much everybody signs on for. But Dylan getting booed at Newport is really the first example of that.
So in a sense, it was an elevation of rock music's cultural importance by the very act of booing it.
Exactly. The fact that, you know, exactly what you said. The rap for a lot of people at Newport was he's selling out to the pop scene. And the fact that instead of being met by adoring fans, he was booed and kept on doing it, meant he wasn't selling out. He was a brave artist going his own way.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, I'm loving the book, which I'm reading now, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you'll come back sometime because I'd also love to talk to you about your alternative history of rock and roll. So I hope we can have you back. But for the meantime, Elijah Wald, author of Dylan Goes Electric, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, and I'd love to come back anytime.
Thank you. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.